June 6, 1944 began quietly for Hans Weber. Too quietly. A thin gray mist clung to the Normandy coast, flattening distance and swallowing sound. From inside his concrete observation bunker, the world felt muted, compressed, unreal. The English Channel stretched outward in a dull metallic gray, restless but not violent. The air smelled of salt, damp earth, and cold iron. It was just after 5 in the morning. Hans Weber had stood watch on this coast for months. Dawn after dawn looked the same. Empty water, low clouds, nothing coming, always waiting. The war, at least here, felt frozen in place, trapped between expectation and boredom. He raised his binoculars out of routine, not concern. At first, he saw nothing. Then he saw something that didn't belong. Where the sea met the sky, a dark line had formed. It wasn't a wave. It wasn't fog. It didn't move like weather. The line sat unnaturally flat across the horizon, perfectly straight, perfectly wrong. As the light slowly improved, it didn't fade. It sharpened, thickened, multiplied. Weber adjusted the focus. His pulse changed before his thoughts did. The line wasn't receding. It was growing. This wasn't the tide. It wasn't a mirage. This was mass. A presence so wide it seemed to bend the horizon itself. Shapes layered behind shapes. Steel stacked on steel. The sea was no longer empty. It was occupied. For a long moment, Weber simply stared. His mind refused to process what his eyes were showing him. This wasn't a fleet. It was a structure, a city, a floating metropolis emerging from the mist and moving steadily toward France. In that instant, before a single Allied soldier touched sand, before the beaches below had names like Omaha or Utah, Hans Weber understood something with chilling clarity. Germany had not been surprised. Germany had been outbuilt. To understand the shock of that morning, you have to understand what Weber believed the world looked like before dawn. Like every German officer stationed along the Atlantic Wall, he had been fed a steady diet of certainty. From Norway to the Spanish border, the Reich had poured concrete, steel, and manpower into what propaganda called Fortress Europe. Bunkers, casemates, gun pits, minefields, obstacles, an impenetrable barrier, at least on paper. Weber was a professional soldier, not a believer. At 32, he was old enough to remember a different Germany and young enough to have been hardened by the Eastern Front. He had seen the difference between slogans and reality, between promises and logistics. His command was a coastal artillery battery, its guns embedded in reinforced concrete. A few miles inland from the beaches the Allies would soon target. From his observation post on a high bluff, he had a commanding view of the channel. Day after day, his men drilled. They calculated firing solutions, maintained their guns, watched the water, always waiting for Tag X, the day everyone knew would come. But where? German intelligence was certain the main attack would strike at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the channel. It was logical, efficient, obvious. That's where the bulk of Germany's western strength waited. Normandy, by contrast, was considered a secondary threat, a possible diversion, a feint. It was a catastrophic assumption, and it wasn't an accident. It was the result of a massive Allied deception effort, false radio traffic, phantom armies, inflatable tanks, that convinced Berlin it was seeing what it wanted to see. While German planners stared north, the real blow gathered in the west. Weber knew the Atlantic Wall better than most. He knew where it was strong and where it wasn't. The defenses were uneven, many bunkers unfinished, minefields incomplete, vast stretches held by understrength units. Even the strongest positions could be isolated, bypassed, smothered. He had seen the blind spots, the gaps in overlapping fire, the farm paths still used by locals. He had no illusions. In the weeks leading up to June, tension became a physical thing. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with reinforcing the coast, had driven his men relentlessly. More mines, more obstacles, jagged steel stakes driven into the beaches. The soldiers called them Rommel's asparagus. Rommel understood a simple truth the High Command ignored. If the Allies weren't stopped on the beaches in the first day, the war in the West was lost. Air power would destroy any German reinforcements moving toward the coast. There would be no second chance. But on June 5th, the weather turned. High winds, rough seas, a storm sweeping across the Channel. German meteorologists confidently predicted that an invasion was impossible for days. Senior officers relaxed. Some even left their posts. Rommel himself traveled back to Germany for his wife's birthday. The storm, they believed, had bought them time. So when Weber stood watch in the cold pre-dawn hours of June 6th, the mood was routine. The storm had passed, but the sea remained choppy. The air still smelled of rain. No one expected anything. He was scanning east when he saw it again. A flicker. Weber raised his Zeiss binoculars and focused. His heart slammed against his ribs. They weren't patrol ships, not a raiding force, not even a fleet in the conventional sense. There were hundreds of vessels, and behind them more, and behind those still more. He swept left, the same, swept right, the same. Everywhere he looked, the horizon was filled. The water was no longer visible between hulls. The Channel had become a solid mass of dark shapes advancing in perfect, relentless order. A cold dread crept up Weber's spine. It felt like staring at a mathematical problem with no solution. German intelligence had estimated the Allies might gather 3,000 ships for an invasion. Even that figure had seemed almost absurd. What Weber was seeing made that estimate laughable. He tried to count, then stopped. It was pointless. Instead, his mind did what it always did under pressure. It categorized. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers circling like predators, and then the others. The endless others. Landing craft of every shape and size, packed so tightly they looked like iron filings drawn to a magnet, row after row, line after line, extending beyond what the eye could track. As the sun climbed higher, the illusion didn't break. It became clearer. The official count would later confirm nearly 7,000 vessels, drawn from 8 nations, the largest amphibious invasion force in history. But to Weber, it wasn't a number. It was a declaration. Germany had built a wall of concrete. The Allies had responded by building a bridge of steel. Weber grabbed the field telephone, his hand slick with sweat. "This is Weber at Observation Post 4, he said. "I have visual contact with the Channel. There are ships." The voice on the other end was tired, dismissive. "We have reports of limited naval movement, Oberleutnant. Possibly a raid. Stand by." "No," Weber said, his voice tightening. "You don't understand." "It is not a raid," he continued. "It is everything." A pause. Disbelief. "The sea conditions." "For God's sake, look at the sea," Weber snapped. "It's covered, horizon to horizon." The line went dead. He tried another channel, regimental headquarters. "The invasion fleet is here," Weber said. "Thousands of ships." He knew he was exaggerating. It felt like an understatement. This time silence stretched longer. Then a quieter voice, more serious. "Weber, are you certain?" Weber looked back through his binoculars. "The weather is clear enough to see the end of the world," he said. "And it's sitting in the Channel. Request permission to engage." The machinery of command hesitated. Plans, maps, assumptions, all frozen by a failure of imagination. While reports of scattered paratroopers inland distracted headquarters, Weber was staring at the real attack. And it was already too late to pretend otherwise. Hans Weber didn't wait for permission. He turned from the telephone and shouted orders down the concrete corridor. Men scrambled from their bunks, boots thudding against stone, eyes still fogged with sleep. Then they reached the embrasures and froze. they saw what he saw. The drills were over. Ammunition crews hauled shells from underground magazines. Rangefinders began calling out numbers, distances so vast they felt theoretical. The massive gun barrels, silent for months, rose slowly, deliberately, pointing toward the sea. Weber pressed the binoculars to his eyes. The fleet was organizing now. Landing craft forming lines, engines humming together into a low, omnipresent vibration that seemed to pass through the earth itself. It sounded like something alive. Not chaotic, not frantic, controlled, measured. The sound of a superpower inhaling. At 5:58 a.m., the order finally came. Engage at will. For Weber, it was a release. Disbelief collapsed into clarity. The moment uncertainty vanished, replaced by action. Fire, he said. The bunker shook as the first gun discharged. Then another. Then another. Shells screamed across the water, leaving Weber's sight before his mind could catch up. He tracked the splashes through his binoculars. Tall columns of white water erupted among the ships. Misses, corrections, adjustments. His crews worked with mechanical precision. For a brief, intoxicating moment, it felt like a real battle, like training mattered. Then he saw it, a direct hit. A destroyer near the front of the formation erupted in smoke and flame. The ship slowed, listed, crippled. Later records would debate whether artillery or a mine finished it, but from Weber's vantage point, his battery had drawn first blood. A cheer echoed inside the bunker. For a few minutes, hope flickered. Then it died. The fleet didn't scatter, it didn't slow. The gap closed seamlessly, swallowed by the mass behind it. The ships kept coming, an iron tide that could not be pushed back. Weber felt it then, the crushing realization. He wasn't fighting an enemy, he was throwing stones at a machine. Beyond his own firing arcs, the real power was awakening. Farther offshore, battleships began to turn, massive hulls rotating with calm inevitability. Weber saw distant flashes, silent at first, like heat lightning on the horizon. Then the sound arrived. The air itself seemed to rip open. The ground heaved. Dirt and concrete exploded skyward. Fields vanished beneath geysers of earth. The systematic dismantling of the Atlantic Wall had begun. Weber scanned the sky. Nothing but Allied aircraft, fighters, bombers, transports, endless streams crossing in disciplined layers. Where was the Luftwaffe? On D-Day, German aircraft across all of France would manage barely a few hundred sorties. The Allies would fly over 14,000. For every German plane, there were dozens of enemy aircraft. Air superiority wasn't contested, it was absolute. German doctrine depended on armored counterattacks, but armor waited for orders. Orders that required approval from far away, tangled in indecision. When the nearest panzer unit finally moved, it advanced without air cover into skies owned entirely by Allied fighter bombers. It was destroyed before reaching the front. Standing amid the thunder of his own guns and the devastation around him, Weber understood something fundamental. This wasn't maneuver warfare. This wasn't strategy versus strategy. This was eradication by scale. The Allies weren't trying to defeat him. They were trying to erase the system he belonged to. As the bombardment intensified, Weber's thinking changed. The tactical part of his mind shut down. As its place came something colder, clearer. He stopped seeing ships. He began seeing factories. Beyond the armada, he imagined assembly lines. Detroit, Pittsburgh, Chicago, producing engines, shells, vehicles without pause. The invasion wasn't a miracle. It was arithmetic. The sky told the same story. Endless C-47 transports, fighter bombers cycling in perfect rotation, fuel, spare parts, pilots trained and replaced as needed. Germany was not losing because its soldiers lacked courage. Germany was losing because it could not compete with this. Then there were the tanks. German armor was feared. Tiger, Panther, technologically superior, but Weber understood the trap. They were complex, expensive, slow to replace. For every Tiger built, the Allies produced dozens of simpler machines. In 1944 alone, the United States would manufacture tens of thousands of tanks. Germany could not match that pace even at its peak. Quality had become irrelevant, quantity sustained. Indefinitely had won. Ideology dissolved under these numbers. No belief system could stop a battleship. No courage could outproduce an assembly line. Weber felt a despair deeper than fear. He wasn't about to die because he'd been outfought. He was about to die because he'd been outnumbered beyond comprehension. By mid-morning, the beaches below were chaos. Weber watched landing craft slam into shore. Ramps dropped. Soldiers poured into surf under machine gun fire. The water darkened. For a moment, just a moment, it looked like the defense might hold. American units pinned down, casualties mounting. Then the equation shifted again. Allied destroyers surged forward, closing dangerously close to shore. They scraped sandbars, risked grounding, and turned their guns directly on German bunkers. Direct fire, point blank. German strongpoints vanished one by one. Strange new machines appeared. Amphibious trucks driving straight out of the sea. Tanks with flails. Detonating mines, armored vehicles designed specifically for this environment. The Germans had nothing comparable. What had been a battle became a process. Methodical, unstoppable. Weber's battery became a target. Shells landed closer. One gun pit vanished in a fireball. Another fell silent. Communications died. He was alone now. He looked upward. The sky was a moving ceiling of Allied aircraft. On the water, waves of landing craft continued to arrive, endlessly replacing the last. Behind them, the Armada waited patiently, a conveyor belt of men and material that would not run dry. By nightfall, the Allies would land thousands of vehicles and tens of thousands of soldiers. The battle would rage for weeks, but the outcome had already been decided. It was only a matter of time and tonnage. For Hans Weber and for every German soldier who survived that day, the rest of the war became an afterword. They would fight on, out of duty, fear, habit, but hope was gone. It had vanished at dawn when the sea turned to steel. We often imagine the fall of the Third Reich as a slow collapse ending in Berlin. But for the men of the Atlantic Wall, the end came in a single moment of realization. The moment they saw a force that was not just an army, but an entire industrial civilization. Unleashed. If you found this perspective compelling, this moment where history pivots not on heroism but on scale, consider subscribing. These are the stories that explain how wars are truly won, not in speeches but in factories,